urgent tone, 6 months into the current conflict with Iran, a dangerous disconnect is widening between Washington's public assurances and the mathematical reality of the battlefield. At the executive level, the declaratory policy is one of absolute abundance. The administration insists the military is, quote, locked and loaded, possessing massive stockpiles of ammunition ready to fire. That narrative is heavily corroborated by Defense Department leadership, with officials publicly dismissing reports of depletion as a manufactured crisis and asserting there is no shortage of defensive or offensive weapons. This chart compares that official declaratory policy against independent stockpile data from the Center for Strategic and International Studies. While the political rhetoric remains a flat, unbroken highline, the physical reality is dropping sharply. In just the first few months of this war, the United States has fired approximately 60% of its entire global stockpile of Patriot interceptor missiles. The depletion rate for the more advanced Terminal High Altitude Area Defense System, or THAAD, is similarly severe, with half of pre-war levels already exhausted. This widening space between the blue line of public rhetoric and the red line of material reality is the credibility gap. Because we live in an era of open-source intelligence and persistent satellite surveillance, adversaries do not have to guess about U.S. inventory levels. They can simply observe the battlefield to verify these shortfalls. Publicly misrepresenting verifiable material constraints fails to preserve deterrence. Instead, it systematically degrades diplomatic leverage and fractures trust with international partners. To understand why this shortage cannot be easily fixed, we have to examine the global architecture that relies on the U.S. defense industrial base. The American defense strategy relies heavily on exquisite munitions. These are highly sophisticated, precision-guided weapons produced in very low volumes. A single Patriot interceptor missile is a masterpiece of modern engineering, costing between $4 and $5 million to build. The THAAD system is even more resource-intensive, requiring up to $12 million for a single interceptor. Adversaries counter this architecture by employing rudimentary, mass-produced suicide drones, overwhelming radar networks through sheer volume rather than sophistication. This chart illustrates the cost-exchange ratio. A $20,000 drone is routinely met by a $4 million interceptor. The U.S. builds around 600 Patriots a year. It takes years of manufacturing to replace munitions expended in weeks. When outspending an adversary yields diminishing returns on this scale, overwhelming economic superiority becomes a strategic vulnerability in a prolonged war of attrition. This material reality directly dictates the behavior of the adversary node in real-world negotiations. On the ground, U.S. commanders are now allowing incoming drones and missiles to strike non-critical areas. They are actively rationing their remaining interceptors to conserve supply. Adversary intelligence tracks these decisions. They see the rationing in real time, validating the mathematical truth of the stockpile shortage, regardless of what is claimed at press briefings. This battlefield exhaustion closely correlates with a sudden U.S. pivot towards securing diplomatic off-ramps and ceasefire agreements. Because the adversary can mathematically prove the U.S. is running out of interceptors, they do not view these diplomatic overtures as political magnanimity. They recognize them as a symptom of operational exhaustion. When a state enters negotiations while attempting to conceal a highly visible military shortfall, it strips itself of coercive leverage. The impact of this shortfall immediately spreads to allied nations, many of whom rely entirely on the U.S. defense umbrella for their own security. Japan configured ships to receive 400 Tomahawk missiles, only to be skipped in the queue because the U.S. military required the inventory for itself. Similarly, Switzerland saw its requested shipments of Patriot missiles indefinitely delayed, as Washington moved to hoard the remaining global supply. This fractures international trust. An ally's confidence evaporates when they discover their primary security guarantor is secretly rationing weapons while projecting an image of infinite abundance. As a direct result, these nations engage in hedging behavior. They actively decouple from their reliance on American supply chains to ensure their own survival. European nations are aggressively ramping up their domestic industrial bases, while states like Saudi Arabia openly explore alternative security pacts with powers like Pakistan and Turkey. A superpower's credibility gap forces its closest allies to dismantle unified security architectures and fend for themselves. Beyond regional partners, this data is being meticulously analyzed by global near peers. Strategic competitors use this current, localized conflict as a proxy test to measure the elasticity and the exact failure points of the U.S. defense industrial base. The rapid depletion of exquisite munitions in the Middle East directly degrades conventional deterrence in the Western Pacific. If the United States cannot rapidly replenish its stockpiles during a contained war against a middle-tier adversary, competitors mathematically calculate that it cannot sustain a high-intensity conflict over Taiwan. This specific structural vulnerability, where official optimism masks industrial failure, has a clear historical precedent. During the Vietnam era, glowing metrics reported from the podium consistently clashed with operational realities on the ground, collapsing both domestic and international support for the effort. Decades later, Soviet state deception during the Afghan War successfully masked terminal logistical exhaustion from the global public right up until the system shattered. Historically, state deception regarding material reality always creates a fatal strategic opening for near-peer competitors to exploit. By stripping away the rhetoric, we are left with the harsh material reality of the global defense architecture. This exposes a core paradox of strategic signaling. Transparency about material constraints preserves more credibility than a fragile, easily disproven bluff. A viable strategic alternative exists, visibly acknowledging the production limits of exquisite munitions while publicly pivoting towards systemic industrial-scale solutions. Openly investing in low-cost interceptors and diversifying medium-range systems signals genuine adaptability, reassuring allies while complicating adversary war plans. Projecting false abundance achieves the exact opposite. It proves to the rest of the world that American deterrence relies heavily on decaying legacy stockpiles rather than current strategic agility. Inside the Pentagon, deputies are frantically issuing memos demanding years-long development cycles be shortened to months, even as political leadership publicly denies a problem exists. The scale required to genuinely fix this production bottleneck mirrors the total war mobilizations of the 20th century. This is what raw industrial truth looks like when a nation actually prepares for attrition. It is measured in factory output, not press conferences. The stark disconnect between the podium and the factory floor is the true source of America's current geopolitical vulnerability. In an era of prolonged conflicts and transparent battlefields, geopolitical leverage is dictated not by the rhetoric or the munitions you possessed on day one, but by the undeniable mathematical output of your industrial base on day 180.